Hey everybody, this is Russ from RetroGameCore. At long last, I finally have the RGB10 Max in my hands. This thing got lost in the mail for almost a month, but it finally arrived at my doorstep yesterday. And initially I was just going to do an impressions video, basically say, hey, here's how I feel about it right now. But at some point, I kind of came to a conclusion where I was like, you know what, this thing's been around for a while now, I should just do an in-depth review instead. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to do a full-on unboxing all the way through to the in-depth review. And I think the only reason that I can review this device with confidence is because the chipset that this device uses is a known commodity at this point. The RK3326 is just a household name in handheld retros right now. Between the RG351 devices, the original RGB10, as well as the Odroid Go Super, which this device is a clone of. So let's do a deep dive review. Kick back, grab a beer, and we're going to spend the next 25 minutes or so going over this device. All those little things that matter to me and that I hope matter to you as well. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. So first and foremost, let's talk about some of the specs on this device. As I mentioned before, it has an RK3326 chipset, which is a quad-core 1.5 GHz CPU, and it has a gig of RAM. What this translates to you is basically everything through the 16-bit era and before are going to run just great on this device. So basically everything up to PlayStation is going to play pretty good, including arcade games through the early to mid-90s. Now there are some systems that are playable on this device, but they're not perfect, and these are the ones listed here. In general, I would expect to be able to play about half of the PSP, Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and DS games in their catalog, and a good chunk of Atomic Wave and Naomi games too, and just a smattering of 3DO and Sega Saturn games. In general, my recommendation is to not have any expectations for these systems, but instead treat these like an added bonus, so that way if they do happen to work well, it's like a pleasant surprise rather than a disappointment. Now what makes this device stand out is that it has a 5-inch IPS laminated display. The screen resolution is 854 by 480 pixels, and it has a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. These are the same specs that are on the Odroid Go Super, but there are some significant differences between this screen and that screen, and we'll get into that. Additionally, this device has a 2.4 GHz Wi-Fi chip, and the marketing materials say it has Bluetooth, but I was not able to get it to work. It runs a 4,200 mAh battery. It says it's going to get 7 to 8 hours of gameplay, but personally my experience over the past couple days has been about 6 hours of gameplay. Okay, let's do a quick unboxing here. I was expecting this box to be so beat up, given the fact that it took about 40 days to reach me, but no, I guess somebody just forgot about it. The PowKiddy box itself is super plain, there's nothing really on it. It comes with a really quick instruction manual and then a USB-C charging cable. And that's it. Alright, moment of truth here. Yeah, I picked the orange one. I thought I might as well just go for it. Now right off the bat, I noticed something was wrong with the screen on my device. And if you look here on the right side, it's sticking out a little bit from the frame. And I had heard others who had had the same problem. And sure enough, if I just wedged my fingernail in there very lightly, I could pull the entire screen off if I wanted to. That's not a good sign. So my plan is just to kind of push this down and just be really gentle with it. And then I bought some B7000 adhesive. And I'll do a separate video later to show you how to reapply the adhesive to the screen in case this happens to you too. Now after sorting out that whole screen thing, the next thing I noticed is the rubber coating on this device. And this coating is very interesting. Someone described it to me like the inside of a brand new car. And I don't disagree, that's kind of how it feels. It's very grippy and just a tiny bit squishy. It's a pretty pleasant experience, but I do worry how it's going to feel a year or two from now, just like with a car when it starts to age. Overall, I think the build quality is very nice. It feels very well made. So without even touching any buttons at all, I was already starting to like this device a lot. But let's start touching some buttons. So we'll start with the face buttons here. They have a good amount of travel. I like how they're smooth in the front. They don't have any sort of markings on them. These are the exact same buttons on the original RGB10, so I'm very familiar with them, and I can tell you they are excellent buttons for retro gaming. They're very light and easy to push down on and very responsive. Same thing with the D-pad, it has a good amount of travel and it's very light to the touch. I would say it has a little bit less resistance than something on like an RG351 device, but at the same time it's a really good old school D-pad. When it comes down to it, the D-pad feels good, has a tiny bit of pivot to it, it's a good D-pad. Now the analog sticks are a known commodity as well, they're basically Nintendo Switch analog sticks. They feel good, they're nice and zippy, and thankfully they click down as well, so you have L3 and R3 buttons. Now paradoxically, they put the start and select buttons on the bottom, and these are very clicky like chiclet buttons here. Same thing up on the top, they have two function buttons that do the same thing. Now these shoulder buttons, people are divided on these. I actually really like the shoulder buttons on this device. They don't have a lot of travel to them. They're very easy to push down on, but I kind of like that aspect because I'm never going to accidentally push a shoulder button. One of the things I really like about these shoulder buttons, which are the same as on the RGB10, is that you can push them from the side on the L1 and R1 buttons and it works. I really appreciate that. Up top you have a power button, reset button, and then a Wi-Fi on and off switch, which I really like because it's nice to be able to turn off the Wi-Fi and save battery. But at the same time, it's a little bit difficult to push the toggle back and forth unless you have some pretty good fingernails. Also up top you have two USB-C ports, one's for charging, one's for peripherals, your headphone jack, and then your SD card slot. So my device, which came from RetroMimi.com, just came with this 64GB generic SD card. These are really prone to failure, so I recommend that you change these out for a more reputable brand. And finally, up top you have volume up and down buttons. On the bottom you have two speaker holes, but there's only one speaker and it's on the left side, which is really unfortunate to me and I think it's a missed opportunity. I would have loved to have had stereo sound in this device. Okay, let's power it up and see how long it takes to actually start up using the stock firmware here. Now they're running EmuELEC on this device. They didn't get permission to actually use it, which is kind of shady of them, and they loaded it up with a bunch of games, which is even shadier as well, but all the same, we'll talk about that later. As you can see, it takes about 21 seconds to boot up from the beginning of pushing the power button to navigating the menus. And that's very average for this chipset. It's not fast or slow. I don't think there's anything to complain about there. This is the interface here. You basically navigate through your system, and then you pick your game, and then you go from there. And altogether on my 64GB card, there's about 5,000 games on here. A lot of them are junk, but at the same time, if you don't know how to add your own games, or this is maybe like your first handheld, this might be of benefit to you. Now some of the games have media scraped for them. For example, you can see here with Altered Beast, they have the video already scraped for you. But that doesn't happen with every game in here. And some of these games were organized in a way that might be confusing to you as a Westerner. For example, here you can see NES games were stored in the family computer section, which is what it was called in Japan. But let's boot up a game and see what it's like. So first thing you're going to notice is that they stretched out every game to fill up the entire screen. And the next thing I notice is that the speaker that's on the left is fairly loud, like it's pretty impressively loud. But at the same time, you can definitely tell the absence of stereo sound. And with a device that's wide like this, it's very apparent. Now getting back to the screen here, some people like to actually stretch their screen out. I gotta be honest, I used to like it this way as well. But over time I came to appreciate the original aspect ratio in a lot of these games. So let me show you how to switch it back to the original aspect ratio if that's something you want to do. So back in the main menu, you just press the start button and then you go into the game settings menu. Within here, there's a section that says game ratio and it's set to 16:9. So what I would do is change it to core provided. That means that every emulator will tell you which aspect ratio is ideal for that system. And here we are back in Mario 3 and you can see it's running at 4:3 aspect ratio. Now let's talk about how these controls kind of work within a game. And I have to say, the controls on this device when playing retro games is kind of an incredible experience. I really love these lightweight buttons and D-pad. Overall, it just felt like I was in total control of every game. And that's not something I can say about a lot of devices. So to be honest, home run when it comes to the controls. Okay, let's start comparing devices now. We're going to start with the Odroid Go Super since the RGB10 Max is basically a clone of this device. You can see that the Odroid Go Super is significantly larger than the RGB10 Max. And a lot of that has to do with the bezels that are surrounding the Odroid Go Super screen. And one of my biggest complaints about the Odroid Go Super were how small the buttons and D-pad were. So let's measure them here against the RGB10 Max. So 6.9mm for the Odroid Go Super and 7.28 for the RGB10 Max. That doesn't seem like a lot, but it feels pretty significant in your fingertips. I've always felt that the D-pad on the Odroid Go Super is way too small and thin. You can see it's 4.95mm in thickness. The RGB10 Max, which has the exact same D-pad as the RGB10, has a 6.6mm width to its D-pad, and I think that's just about perfect for this device. And honestly, I think this is a more impressive feat, and it makes the RGB10 Max feel much more balanced. It's both smaller than the Odroid Go Super and has bigger and more comfortable controls. It's kind of the best of both worlds. Now, despite the fact that the Odroid Go Super has these larger bezels around its screen, it's actually a superior display over the RGB10 Max. It's definitely a more vibrant and bright display. But I think 9 times out of 10, I would take the smaller bezels and the inferior display over these big old bezels on the Odroid Go Super. Okay, moving on to comparisons, here's the Nintendo Switch Lite. Now this device has a 5.5-inch display, so a little bit bigger a display, but you can see here it's a bigger device as well, and it also has smaller buttons and D-pad than the RGB10 Max. Surprisingly, I'd rather hold the RGB10 Max than the Nintendo Switch Lite. which is quite impressive for a company that's so small compared to Nintendo. Now, the only device that actually is more compact than the RGB10 Max is the PS Vita. And while the PS Vita is not quite as thick as the RGB10 Max, the RGB10 Max is significantly shorter than the other one. So it's just kind of longer and shorter, and I kind of actually like that in the hands. Now, the PS Vita also has smaller buttons and D-pad than the RGB10 Max. Again, I think it's just quite an engineering feat that they got something that has such a big screen but small device with big ol' comfortable analog sticks and buttons. And just for comparison's sakes, here's the RG351P, which has a 3.5-inch display. And it's kind of crazy, right? The screen absolutely dwarfs the 351P, but the buttons, the D-pad, the analog sticks, they're all basically the same size as the 351P. I'm beating a dead horse here, but from a design standpoint, this is basically a home run as well. The only thing they kind of screwed up is putting the start and select buttons on the bottom, because that's not the standard place to put start and select buttons. They're better fitting up on the top. I'm sure you think I'm done with comparisons. I'm not. Let's do some weight comparisons. Here's 215 grams for the RGB10 Max. Compare that to the Odroid Go Super, which is 283 grams. And then compare that to the Nintendo Switch Lite, which is 288 grams. This thing is light. Even something like the 2000 model of the PS Vita is heavier than the RGB10 Max. That's just kind of crazy to me. It's lighter than the RG351V, and it is a little bit heavier than the RG351P, but that makes sense. And it's significantly lighter than the RG351M in its aluminum shell. Yeah, so overall, 216 grams, that's really impressive. For another comparison, look at this. The Xbox One controller, 291 grams. And the PS4 controller is 218 grams. So the PS4 controller, which I've always considered to be a very lightweight controller, is actually heavier than the RGB10 Max, which has a screen and a processor and everything else inside. I think this is going to be a really good device for long gameplay sessions. Okay, let's do some screen comparisons here. We'll start with the 351V. You can see that obviously the 5-inch screen on the RGB10 Max definitely looks a lot bigger than the RG351V in the menus. But let's do some real-world gameplay here. We'll start with the 351P comparison. So both of these games are playing in 4:3 aspect ratio, and you can see the amount of playable space on the RGB10 Max is pretty significant compared to the 3.5-inch screen on the 351P. You can see that the RGB10 Max has about 4 inches of screen and a 4:3 display, whereas the 351P has about 3.25 inches of playable space. Now let's take something that has a native 4:3 aspect ratio like the 351V. And this one obviously has 3.5 inches of playable space because it is a 3.5-inch screen at 4:3 aspect ratio. But still, compared to the RGB10 Max, you're getting an additional 1/2 inch of playable space. So if you've ever found any of these 3.5-inch screens to be too small, this is a viable option for you to upgrade the size of your screen without having to make a significant upgrade to the size and weight of your device. And I mentioned it before, I always complained about the Odroid Go Super's bezels. Honestly, when I'm playing 4:3 games on the RGB10 Max, it really doesn't bother me. That amount of black space on the sides is just enough for me to not feel like it's wasted space. And a lot of that has to do with these really thin bezels on this display. As you can see, the display looks very nice. It doesn't have the best viewing angles in the world, and it's not the brightest of displays, but I love that it's OCA laminated and it feels super high quality. Now obviously I kind of got a dud here in the fact that it's coming out of its case a little bit, so I'm going to have to reapply some adhesive here. But me personally, I don't feel it's a big deal because I planned on getting inside this device and making some upgrades to it anyway in a later video. But if you're one of those people who are worried about the quality control of your device and this is something that would bother you, then definitely take it into consideration. And like I mentioned before, I'm still kind of skeptical about this rubber coating. I like it right now, but I'm worried what it's going to look like here in the future. Okay, let's check the light leaking on this device. As you can see here, it has some significant light bleeding in the orange case. On the bottom left of the display, as well as on the top left of the display, and obviously that LED light is just really bright. So I'll address this in a later video, but I think I'm going to have to apply some electrical tape at some strategic points in the device itself to fix a lot of this light bleeding, because I personally like to play my devices in the dark. Now on the opposite end of the spectrum, this device, like I mentioned before, does not have a very bright display. So if you're playing it outside, it's not going to look very good. We took this footage at about 7:30 in the morning on a Sunday morning. This is my son here playing. So if you're one of those people that like to take it with you camping or maybe like to the beach or things like that, you might want to consider something like the RG351V or even the Odroid Go Super. Okay, let's get into gameplay here. I'm going to breeze through some of the easier systems. Things like Super Nintendo, they work just fine. Maybe a little bit of tweaking needs to happen for some of the harder to run games. Genesis across the board will play flawlessly for you. Same thing with PlayStation 1, those all play really well. When it comes to handheld systems, Game Boy Color are just a walk in the park. Game Boy Advance is interesting because it actually looks pretty good at 16:9. But if you put it in its native 3:2 aspect ratio, it still looks very good as well. Because this aspect ratio is a little bit wider than 4:3, you've got really thin bezels to deal with, especially when compared to a 4:3 system like the Nintendo, Super Nintendo, things like that. Now for those of you hoping to just use the card that comes in your device and be able to play every game you want, remember the fact that PSP and PS1 games are very large size, so there's only a few of them actually on the SD card. Here are the PSP games for the system, not great picks really. And same thing with PS1, only a few of them are here, and unless you really love Toy Story 2 games on PS1, you might be disappointed. So yeah, in a quick nutshell, this is how the stock firmware experience is going to be. You're basically going to navigate through EmuELEC, pick your games, and then go from there. So for the rest of the video, I'm just going to take some time and show you the different firmware possibilities that are available for you if you're willing to do a little bit of work and upgrade your device. Now luckily, all the firmwares that I've used on my Odrego Super are basically compatible with this device. So let me show you what I've done on the Odrego Super, which translates to the RGB10 Max. So let's start with an image of the official EmuELEC that I had on the Odrego Super. As you can see here, exact same interface, everything works exactly as intended, but this has been loaded up with my own games. On top of that, I've done things like added bezels to the sides of my Super Nintendo and Nintendo games, and as you can see here, it just kind of fills up that extra black space, and looks really nice in my opinion. I really like having themes to my bezels like this. And all the ports that work on EmuELEC will work on this device as well. For example, here you can see the widescreen Sonic the Hedgehog ports. So I would recommend, if you like the stock firmware, to install the actual official version of EmuELEC and then consult all the different guides and get it up to speed and running. Now personally, my favorite custom firmware to use on this device is called RetroOZ. This is a fork of RGOS, which is one of my favorite firmwares available on the RG351 series. And as you can see, it looks and feels a lot like RGOS. And on top of that, this developer has taken a lot of those open source improvements that are available in RGOS and other open source firmwares and implemented them here in RetroOZ. So for example, if I go into the Nintendo 64 emulators, you can see that I have 4 different emulators that are available and multiple cores within that. So personally, I like to use the standalone Mupen 64 Plus emulator. And as you can see here, I'm playing F-Zero X at full speed. And this game has always been a pain in my side when it comes to RK3326 devices like this. So the fact that it's running at full speed is a good indication that if you're willing to experiment with the different emulators that are available, you might be able to get some really good gameplay out of this. For example, Wave Race right here is running at just about full speed. I'm getting a little bit of audio crackling, but that's about it. And this is a pretty hard game to emulate, so that's a really good indication as well. Now it's not all perfect. For example, here you can see with Cruisin' USA, it's only running at about 75% speed. To me, that is just on the cusp of being unplayable. So not every game's going to be perfect. One nice thing about having a widescreen like this is that when you're playing a DS game, you can actually just show both games on the same screen, and it's actually a decent size when you're playing it. So if there's a particular DS game that you want to play that you need to see both screens, this might be a good option for you. Now bear in mind, there is no touchscreen on this, so you still have to deal with all that. Now when it comes to PSP, it's just a pain in the butt. So in general, just don't expect to play like 3D or hardware intensive games like God of War. But if you want to play puzzle games or maybe some racing games, those would work pretty well. I have an entire guide on PSP for 351 devices, which is the same chipset as this one. And that guide, which is a video as well as a written guide, is going to be applicable to this device as well. So check that out if you want to know how to set up all your PSP settings. Okay, now here's one I'm actually very excited about, and this is Dreamcast on this device. I've been working with the developer of RetroOZ, and he's agreed to implement a widescreen version of the RetroRun emulator that'll run Dreamcast. What that basically means is that you're going to have the best Dreamcast experience available on this chipset, on this device, and it's going to play games in widescreen. Now, in order to get a game to play in widescreen and not look stretched, you have to do a couple little hacks, but I'm telling you, it's not very hard and it's totally worth it. Look at how Crazy Taxi 2 looks right here. It's just incredible to me. So if you're interested in me making a guide for this, let me know in the comments below. You can see here with Power Stone, it's running at full speed and it's in widescreen, taking advantage of every millimeter of the screen that's on this device. Far and away, playing widescreen Dreamcast games on this device at full speed using this entire 16:9 display is one of my favorite gaming experiences of the past couple months. So let me know if you want to see more about this. When it comes to arcade gameplay, everything works really well. You can basically play anything MAME 2003 Plus, as well as Final Burn Neo, at full speed. You're just going to be limited to like games from the 80s and early 90s and stuff like that, but in general, all your favorite classics are going to be available. Now, a lot of people ask me to show off vertical gameplay on this device, so here is Striker's 1945-3 running at a vertical orientation. And I've done an entire video on how to set this up on this chipset. I did it with a 351p earlier in the year. But in a nutshell, I think this device is too short and too wide in order to be a viable option for vertical gameplay. I think that a 3x2 display like the original RGB10 or the 351p are more suited for vertical gameplay with arcade games like this. Now, switching gears here to a really good experience, playing Shovel Knight on this device in widescreen like this is just a whole nother level compared to something like the 351p or even the 351v. Because the buttons and the D-pad and everything else are just perfect for this game, and I love playing it in this 5-inch 16:9 display. Another game that's just incredible on this device is the Super Mario 64 standalone port. And I've talked about this several times with the RetroOZ Super, but this runs at 60 frames per second, and it fills up the entire screen without squishing anything, and it's just incredible. This is easily the best way to play Mario 64 that I've found so far. Okay, so that's RetroOZ. Let's talk a little bit about LineageOS. And LineageOS is basically Android 11 on this device. All you have to do is flash this Android firmware onto an SD card, and then just sideload a bunch of Android apps, and then you're good to go. Now, unfortunately, the built-in Wi-Fi does not work on this operating system right now, but you can use a USB-C adapter and then a Wi-Fi USB adapter. And you're going to have to restart the system once you plug it in, but after that you can get 5 GHz Wi-Fi signal. Let's run the speed test app so I can show you what kind of speeds you can get with the Wi-Fi. So you can see here, these are pretty good speeds. These are about on average what I get on my computers here at home. Now bear in mind, I live in Hawaii and the ping is just atrocious when it comes to online gameplay. But in general, this is really impressive, the kinds of speed you can get on this Android operating system. One of the great things about Android is how easy it is to do game streaming. So here I'm going to use AMD Link to connect to my computer. Now, to be honest, I don't have a lot of gaming set up on my computer right now. If you remember, about a week and a half ago, I got hacked, so I wiped my entire PC and I lost a lot of my emulator settings. So I'm kind of starting from scratch again here, but at the very least, I set up Dolphin so that I could run a few GameCube games and show that off to you. And as you can see, there is quite a bit of stuttering using this Wi-Fi antenna. And that's unfortunate, and obviously your results are going to vary based on your router and everything else. But at the same time, I was hoping I would get better streaming quality out of this device. On the flip side, when I plug this device directly into an Ethernet cable, I get flawless streaming. No stutters, no pauses, things like that. Now obviously it's not ideal to have a cable hooked up to your device while you're playing. That's the whole point of handheld gaming. But all the same, this is a good indicator that if we can get some good Wi-Fi drivers on this operating system, that we can have really good game streaming. A couple more scenarios for you. So for example, I'm still using AMD Link here to stream to my PC, but then I've opened up Chrome and started up Stadia on my device. And it's just running at full screen here, and as you can see, it's running great. Now bear in mind that Stadia is not officially supported in Hawaii, so I do get a lot of jitters and things like that, but it's on the Stadia side. It has nothing to do with this device. But in general, if you wanted to play some AAA games via Stadia, this is a viable option. It's really going to come down to how quick your Wi-Fi speed is with your router and everything else. Alright, we've been at this for a while. Let's start the summary portion of this review. Let's start with what I like. First and foremost, I like the overall build quality of this device. Now I put an asterisk here because obviously I had some issues with the adhesive on my screen. And I don't think that's going to happen to everybody. I have read that this has happened to other people, but it seems to be the minority case. All the same, I can't give it a 10 out of 10 when it comes to build quality, just because I personally had that experience too. I've said it several times now, but I'm in love with the face buttons and D-pad of this device. And I'm so thankful for the fact that it has these thin screen bezels. And at the same time, this device is great for 16:9 or 3x2 games. And I also appreciate the rubber coating on this case, but again, I gave this one an asterisk because I'm interested to see what it looks like a year from now. Okay, some other things I like about this device. I like that it has internal Wi-Fi chip, and I like that it has a toggle on it so that you can turn it off and save battery life. I also really appreciate that they use the Nintendo Switch analog sticks, and that they have clickable L3 and R3. And I'm just super impressed by the compact form factor of this device. They packed so much into this device without making it too big, and I'm really impressed by that. And on top of that, they made it fairly lightweight for its size. As you saw, it's about the weight of a PS4 controller. And then I have mixed feelings about this, but I do appreciate that it's interoperable with RetroOZ Super, because that means that any of the gains that they've made with the firmwares and everything else for the RetroOZ Super are going to translate easily over to the RGB10 Max. It basically gives this device a head start when it comes to having a fully formed and mature firmware. Okay, so that's what I like about the device. Let's talk about what I don't like about the device. First and foremost, the first thing out of the gate for me is that I don't like the screen adhesive they used because mine's already coming off right out of the box. I'm also concerned about long-term care of the rubber coating. We've talked about that enough. I don't mind this orange color. I think it's actually really distinct and it reminds me of like an orange creamsicle. But at the same time, the only choices you have are just 100% black or this orange color. I think that they had played around with different colors with the buttons and everything else like that, it would have been really cool. And like I showed earlier, there is a significant amount of light bleeding when you play this in the dark. And probably the biggest design flaw of this device is that it only has a single speaker. Okay, more issues with the device. Number 6 here is that the Wi-Fi antenna strength is not great. And as we saw earlier, screen brightness is not great on this device. It's fine when you're playing indoors, but if you ever wanted to play this device outdoors, you might run into an issue. I also think that the position of the start and select buttons on the bottom like this is kind of a boneheaded move. And then this is just a sign of the climate of the community right now. The chipset that's on this device has basically run its course at this point. We've all seen what this device can do and what it can't do, and everybody's waiting for that next big thing. And finally, my last point here is that $120 for this device seems a little bit high in the context of the other devices that are available at a much cheaper price point. For example, the RGB10 goes for about $75. But I'm just trying to figure out where that $45 upgrade actually exists. So in a nutshell, the RGB10 Max is a flawed device. And I think all these devices are at this sub $200 price point. But for all the little things that bother me just a little bit about this device, there are a ton of other things that just overwhelmingly make this a positive experience. I'm not head over heels in love with this device, but overwhelmingly I'm impressed with it and I can't wait to continue playing it for the next few months. Alright everyone, wrapping up here, I think there are two audiences that will really appreciate this device. The first are the people who just want a big device that looks like a Nintendo Switch and they can just plug in and play games and they don't worry about aspect ratio or any other kind of stuff. The other half of the audience are going to be tinkerers and other people like me, who don't mind getting into the inner workings of the device and tweaking it just for all their needs. And I think from that perspective, the RGB10 Max is a home run. It's not a grand slam, but at the same time, it has just enough upgrades to really make it a compelling device. And I think this larger screen is something that really has to be seen to appreciate it. It makes the retro gaming experience that much more immersive. I think if you want a good feeling retro handheld device that has a decent amount of power, a pretty good price, and a nice big screen, the RGB10 Max is a no-brainer. The real decision point is going to come down to whether or not you already have a device with this chipset, and whether or not that upgraded price is going to be worth it for you. Personally, if I only had an RG351P and no other device, this would be a huge and easy upgrade to make. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. I really appreciate you sticking around. I know this was a long one. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming!